If you follow professional bass fishing, you know that forward-facing sonar is becoming the most dominant tool in tournaments. There are a lot of questions being asked about how forward-facing sonar, or Livescope, is impacting fisheries, bass behavior, and the patterns that pros are using in tournaments. To get to the bottom of some of these questions and provide some context, we actually pulled data from over 20 years of professional bass fishing tournaments, and were able to draw a line in the sand between the pre-Livescope and post-Livescope era to show how Livescope has impacted tournament bass fishing. I have a lot of great insights in this video you're not going to want to miss, so let's get right into it. Before we get started, I want to give you a quick high-level overview of the data set we're using for this analysis. All this data comes from the Deep Dive App's database of over 10,000 tournament patterns that's been collected by professional anglers from observed fish catches in recorded fishing days. So this is from past fishing tournaments, old TV shows, live streams, everything like that. We actually collect all the data on what patterns our pros are using, the sections of the lake they fish, all kinds of data, along with whether they use Livescope or not as a primary factor in their patterns. Using all this data, we're able to actually determine when the introduction of Livescope started to really make its presence shown in professional tournaments. And we see that 2020 is really when Livescope started to take off in terms of popularity in tournament patterns. So everything from 2019 and before can be seen as the pre-Livescope era, and then everything from 2020 to 2023 is the post-Livescope era. We don't have data in for 2024 yet, but we do have a lot of data from the past 3 years, so it should give us a really good idea of how Livescope has been changing the patterns and strategies anglers are using in tournaments. Awesome, so now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into some of the high-level statistics from the pre-Livescope and post-Livescope eras. We'll start out with the fishing style that anglers use to get top 10 finishes in tournaments. Overall, you can see that shallow water strategies account for 61% of top 10 finishes in the pre-Livescope era, but only 51% in the post-Livescope era. This means that more anglers are getting top 10 finishes offshore, which makes sense because Livescope does make it easier to target those fish in offshore areas. Next, let's take a look at the different water clarities and sections of lake that produce top 10 finishes between these two eras. Overall, there's not that big of a difference between the pre-Livescope and post-Livescope era in terms of where anglers are generating top 10 finishes in different sections of the lake and in different water visibilities. Stained water is the dominant water clarity in both eras, and the mid-lake is the dominant section of lake in both eras. So it doesn't seem like there's this drastic shift in where anglers are targeting fish or the productive areas within a lake, at least at this high-level view, though that might be a little bit deceiving, which you'll see here in a second. Next, if we take a look at the types of cover and structure that generated top 10 finishes, you can see that the shell bed was the #1 cover for generating top 10 finishes in the pre-Livescope era, where the brush pile is the #1 cover in the post-Livescope era. Overall though, there's not that big of a difference between the two eras again when you compare all the different covers and structures that generated top 10 finishes. And this is very interesting because you would think there would be more of a difference, and there actually is, but one thing that's not reflected here is that in the post-Livescope era, especially in 2020 and 2021, there weren't that many anglers that were using Livescope. It was still relatively new. So a lot of this data is still from anglers who are using non-Livescope patterns. So to kind of adjust for that, I wanted to break out the Livescope patterns specifically versus the non-Livescope patterns in the 2020 to 2023 range, or the post-Livescope era. This will allow us to get a lot better picture of how strategies are changing when anglers are exclusively using Livescope versus the anglers who are still using traditional strategies. Going back to some of the high-level metrics I shared earlier, in the post-Livescope era, again 2020 to 2023, you can see that anglers that did use Livescope generated 83% of their top 10 finishes offshore. This is compared to non-Livescopers that only generated 36% of their top 10 finishes offshore. The non-Livescope statistics here actually match up really well with the pre-Livescope era we showed earlier, though the Livescopers, you can see, are really focused on that offshore pattern. And so by separating these two out, you can see that the stats look very different when we separate them compared to when we were grouping them all together. Moving on to water clarity and section of lake, you can actually see that stained water is still the most effective water clarity for both Livescopers and non-Livescopers in the post-Livescope era. Section of lake, though, does vary between these two fishing styles. Overall, the lower end and the mid lake absolutely dominate the top 10 finishes generated by live scopers compared to a relatively even distribution for non-live scopers, and especially that upper end of the lake is more of a player when you're not using live scope. Not a lot of top 10 finishes come on the upper end of the lake when anglers were using their live scope. The difference between the live scope and non-live scope patterns become more obvious after taking a look at the types of cover and structure that are generating top 10 finishes. Overall, anglers that are using live scope are focusing on brush piles, bait fish, and shell beds, and they're targeting offshore flats, rounded points, and ditches. All of these are offshore areas, and if you've used live scope before, you know that it is a very effective tool at fishing suspended fish in brush piles, suspended bass around bait fish, and then also targeting fish around shell beds, on ledges, and things like that. For the non-live scopers, you can see that docks, offshore grass, and rock transitions are the best types of cover. And these types of covers are easier to fish with traditional fishing techniques, and you don't have as much of an advantage using live scope in these areas, though that is changing and anglers are getting really good at using live scope in these areas as well. So this data could be changing as anglers get more proficient with shallow water live scoping. And then as far as structure goes for these non-live scope patterns, again, these structures are actually very similar to what anglers were doing in the pre-live scope era. And that makes sense because these guys are using pre-live scope era techniques to target these fish. So from the data we can see here, there is a big difference in the type of cover and structure and even areas that anglers are targeting when they're exclusively focused on forward-facing sonar or live scope. And we're going to see this continue, I feel like, as anglers become more proficient at forward-facing sonar. It becomes a bigger part of all the different anglers' games. One last thing I did want to look at as well are the baits that are generating top 10 finishes for, again, the live scopers and the non-live scopers. For live scope patterns, you can see the deep diving jerkbait, drop shot, and jig head minnow are the top 3 most dominant baits. And the jig head minnow is on the rise. If you watch tournament fishing in 2024, it's becoming one of the most dominant baits. We don't have data for 2024 yet in our database, but as we add that data here over the next few months, I'm sure that jig head minnow will become even more of a player in these top 10 finishes. But all 3 of these baits are fantastic forward-facing sonar baits and have contributed to a lot of top finishes the past 3 years. As far as non-live scope baits, you can see the bladed jig or a chatterbait, as well as the Texas rig creature bait and the jig are the most dominant baits. These baits have been super effective for years and years, and these were the top baits in the pre-live scope era as well. So it's not a big surprise that we see these baits here. What is interesting though is that the baits that generate top 10 finishes for the live scope patterns are completely different from those that are generating top 10 finishes for non-live scope patterns. And while a lot of the baits in the live scope category are great at targeting suspended fish, I think a lot of anglers are starting to realize that they can use these traditional non-live scope baits to catch fish like a jig. Tyler Williams on the Bassmaster Elite Series is a great example. He did really well at the most recent Lake Fork event using a jig almost exclusively to catch his fish when most anglers were throwing jerk baits, drop shots, jig head minnows. So I think anglers are going to start adapting and bringing strategies and techniques from that pre-live scope era and applying them to the live scope techniques and potentially doing some damage on the professional tour. Now that we've looked at all the data, let's get into some of my key takeaways from this analysis. One thing I found very interesting is that it doesn't seem like bass are setting up in completely different sections of the lake or different water clarities. If you compare the pre-live scope to post-live scope era, or even the non-live scope to live scope patterns in that 2020 to 2023 range, you can see that the stained water is still the most effective water visibility. That mid-lake section of the lake still generates a ton of top 10 finishes in both eras or both styles of fishing. And really the only thing we notice changing is that with the live scope patterns, the dirty water and upper end of the lakes are less effective or have produced less top 10 finishes. Now there's 2 ways to think about that. One, it's that you just can't use live scope very effectively in that dirty water or in the upper end of certain lakes. But from some of the recent tournaments we've seen from, for example, Santee Cooper on the BPT Tour, the anglers are able to catch fish in that dirty, muddy water with forward-facing sonar. So instead of thinking that you can't catch fish in that upper end, dirty water section of the lake, maybe it's that anglers haven't figured out how to tap into those fish with forward-facing sonar yet. And it could leave a golden opportunity for anglers to actually find an advantage over their competition by figuring out how to catch those bass that are in that upper end of the lake in that dirty water with their forward-facing sonar. There are a lot of anglers that are actually targeting fish in really shallow water with their Livescope, catching them off cypress trees or shallow laydowns, rocky banks, things like that. And it's something I've done myself, though not that much, and it's something I want to explore a lot more. You can actually see these fish on forward-facing sonar in 2, 3, 4 feet of water and target them specifically. And if anglers can really start to dial that in, it really opens up that upper end of the lake and that dirty water to a lot of possibilities with that forward-facing sonar. Another thing I find interesting is that the majority of anglers that are getting top 10 finishes using Livescope are focused on fishing offshore. And like I mentioned earlier, you can still use forward-facing sonar or Livescope in shallow water, though it's definitely easier to use in that deeper water range. This means that, again, there's some untapped potential in fishing shallow water with Livescope, and if someone can unlock that, I think that it really could be the future of how a lot of tournaments get won. This could be a little bit scary for anglers that kind of want to protect that shallow water zone and maybe have that to themselves. And I've heard that argument before. All the anglers are going to be going offshore and live scoping, which is going to leave the bank open to all the anglers that want to fish shallow. And I don't know if that's 100% true, because we're seeing a lot of anglers at Lake 4, Santee Cooper, things like that, catching fish with their forward-facing sonar again in that super shallow water. So I think it's just a matter of time before anglers figure that out and start catching fish in that way. And this could completely change the data, especially as anglers get more proficient with Livescope. So I may have to redo this analysis in a year or 2 years, because fishing is constantly changing. And as anglers perfect techniques, as they unlock new capabilities of the tooling, figure out new strategies, all of this data is subject to change. So hopefully you found something interesting from this data, but also don't think about this as a set in stone best practice for using forward-facing sonar or the best areas to fish, because this data is just based on what has happened in the past. It doesn't necessarily predict what will happen in the future. And when I'm analyzing this data, I'm actually looking for the patterns, the areas, the techniques that are the least used or maybe underrepresented in the data, because it means that those types of patterns, areas, things like that are getting the least fishing pressure. Now, not all of them are going to be effective, and you might waste a ton of time going to the upper end of the lake, fishing in dirty water with Livescope and not catching anything. But if you can figure it out, you could have that all to yourself. So kind of cool, like looking at the data. Hopefully you guys enjoyed as well. If you want more videos like this, definitely leave a like down below. Leave a comment letting me know any insights that you draw from the data or anything you saw that I missed. Really interested to hear what you guys have to say, and love to have a great discussion down in the comments. Thanks again for checking out this video. We'll see you on the next one.